The date is the 16th of July, 1054. Cardinal Humbert, representing the Catholic Church delegation, entered the Hagia Sophia and placed a document before Patriarch Michael of Constantinople, who was preparing for the liturgy. After doing so, Humbert left Hagia Sophia, then departed Constantinople and returned to Rome. The document he placed before the Patriarch declared that Patriarch Michael had been excommunicated by the Bishop of Rome, that is, the Pope. On the same day, the Patriarch convened a church council and excommunicated those who had excommunicated him. Thus, the 16th of July, 1054, was recorded as the date on which the Western and Eastern churches officially separated. What historians call the Great Schism was not in fact a sudden rupture caused by a single event. The roots of the separation between the two churches stretched back hundreds of years. Throughout the Middle Ages, one of the most fundamental disputes among Christian clergy concerned which church held universal supremacy. The bishops of Rome, namely the popes, argued that supremacy belonged to the Western Church. Their reasoning was that Peter, one of Jesus' apostles, had come to Rome, founded a church there, and was martyred in that city. According to the papacy, Peter was the first bishop of Rome, and those who followed him sat on the papal throne as his representatives. In addition, Paul, who played a major role in spreading Christianity, had also come to Rome and was martyred there. According to the Western Church, the remains of both apostles were buried beneath a church in the Vatican. Thus, the Church of Rome claimed to be built upon the graves of Christianity's two greatest martyrs, which it considered proof of its universal supremacy. In contrast, the Eastern Church explained its supremacy through a more worldly perspective. Constantinople was the capital of the empire and the residence of the emperor. In pre-Christian Roman tradition, emperors were regarded as the heads of religious authority. This tradition continued after the imperial capital was moved to Constantinople. Emperors such as Constantine, Theodosius, and Justinian exercised authority over religious matters. For the Eastern Church, the issue was simple. Wherever the emperor resided, the church of that city should be superior to all others. This struggle for supremacy played a significant role in widening the rift between the Eastern and Western churches. The issue was not about whose arguments were more reasonable. Both churches sought power over the other. From what has been described so far, the conflict appears more political than religious. However, there was also a cultural dimension. By the year 1054, several fundamental differences had existed between the two churches for many years. Some of these differences may seem minor, but over time they contributed to the eventual division. For example, growing beards became a tradition among the clergy in the Eastern Church, while no such custom existed in the Western Church. Clergy in the Eastern Church were allowed to marry, whereas marriage was forbidden for clergy in the Western Church. Another major problem between the two churches was language. When the Roman Empire was divided in 395, the boundaries that emerged were not only political, but also cultural. Latin culture dominated in the West, while Greek culture prevailed in the East. The official language of the Western Church was Latin, whereas Greek was used in the Eastern Church. From the 5th century onward, even emperors abandoned Latin and began to speak and write in Greek. Over time, language became a serious problem between the two churches, because they were no longer aware of each other's theological debates. For example, a letter sent to Constantinople in the 5th century remained unanswered for months in Rome because there was no one capable of translating it. The same situation applied in Constantinople. Letters sent from Rome were written in Latin and were often ignored or considered unworthy of translation. By the 9th century, some Eastern clergy claimed that the Pope spoke the language of barbarians and therefore should never exercise authority over Constantinople. Another major point of contention concerned the doctrine of the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. In the early years of Christianity, emperors convened a series of councils to resolve theological disputes. The first of these councils was held in 325 at Nicaea, Iznik, by Emperor Constantine. The formulation of the Trinity was clarified at the Council of Constantinople in 381, which stated that the Holy Spirit proceeded from the Father. However, the Western Church altered this doctrine at the Council of Toledo in 589, declaring that the Holy Spirit proceeded from both the Father and the Son. The purpose of this change was to emphasize the importance of Jesus and protect him from heretical interpretations. Initially, this caused no major conflict due to the language barrier, as the Iases. Turn clergy claimed that the Pope spoke the language of barbarians and therefore should never exercise authority over Constantinople. Another major point of contention concerned the doctrine of the Trinity: Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. In the early years of Christianity, emperors convened a series of councils to resolve theological disputes. The first of these councils was held in 325 at Nicaea, Iznik, by Emperor Constantine. The formulation of the Trinity was clarified at the Council of Constantinople in 381, which stated that the Holy Spirit proceeded from the Father. However, the Western Church altered this doctrine at the Council of Toledo in 589, declaring that the Holy Spirit proceeded from both the Father and the Son. The purpose of this change was to emphasize the importance of Jesus and protect him from heretical interpretations. Initially, this caused no major conflict due to the language barrier, as the Eastern Church learned of the decision years later. When they did, their stance was clear. They regarded it as heresy. Historians refer to this issue as the Filioque controversy, derived from the Latin phrase meaning "and from the Son." In the early period of Christianity, there was no strict hierarchy among churches. Relations were generally based on the exchange of information. However, with the decisions of ecumenical councils, 5 major churches were recognized as holding authority over others in their respective regions. These were Rome, Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem. Eastern clergy referred to this system as the Pentarchy, or Rule of 5. Initially, the Bishop of Rome was acknowledged as having precedence, but over time emperors sought to increase the importance of Constantinople and gain greater religious authority by drawing other patriarchs to their side. This inevitably deepened the division between East and West. In the early centuries, popes were often forced to submit to the political power of emperors, and imperial approval was required to become pope. This situation lasted for several centuries. During the 8th century, the Eastern Roman Emperor Leo III banned the veneration of icons and religious images, a policy known as iconoclasm. Pope Gregory strongly opposed this policy and wrote a letter declaring excommunication for all those involved. However, the messengers were detained in Sicily, which was under Eastern Roman control, and the letter never reached Constantinople. In 751, the Lombards captured several cities in northern Italy and began to threaten Rome. This marked a turning point in the history of the Catholic Church. The Pope requested assistance from the Frankish king, Pepin the Short. Pepin, a devout ruler, accepted the request and marched into Italy with his army, defeating the Lombards. His generosity did not end there. He declared that the lands stretching from Rome to Ravenna were donated to the papacy. As a result, the Pope became not only the sole religious authority in the West, but also the ruler of a territorial state in central Italy. This was a major turning point in Christian history. The process continued when Pepin's son, Charlemagne, was crowned emperor by the Pope in 800. At the same time, the Eastern Roman throne was occupied by Empress Irene, a woman. Since it was widely believed that an emperor should be male, Charlemagne's coronation implied that imperial authority now resided in the West. Although Irene was deposed in 802 and replaced by Nikephoros, neither the papacy nor the Franks were willing to relinquish their claim to the imperial title. This further deepened the division. The final breaking point occurred shortly after the Normans conquered southern Italy. These regions had previously been under Eastern Roman control, but from the 11th century onward they gradually fell into the hands of Catholic Norman rulers. However, the churches in the region continued to follow Eastern rites. In 1053, the Pope issued a decree requiring these churches to adopt Latin rites, otherwise they would be closed. This decision was met with outrage in the East, and in retaliation the Patriarch ordered all Latin churches in Constantinople to be closed. The disagreement between the two churches suddenly escalated into a diplomatic crisis. In an attempt to find a compromise, the Pope sent a delegation led by the French Cardinal Humbert to Constantinople in June 1054. Relations between Cardinal Humbert and Patriarch Michael deteriorated from the very beginning. Humbert presented a letter urging the Patriarch to submit to papal authority, and his condescending attitude during the meetings deeply offended Michael. After this, the Patriarch refused to receive the Roman delegation for a long time. After remaining in Constantinople for several weeks, Humbert, angered by the treatment he received, entered Hagia Sophia on the morning of the 16th of July and placed the papal bull of excommunication on the altar before the Patriarch. This was the final straw. With the support of his clergy, Patriarch Michael first excommunicated Cardinal Humbert and then the entire delegation. With this decision, the Eastern and Western churches were completely severed from one another. At first, the general population was not greatly affected, and Eastern and Western Christians continued to coexist peacefully in many regions. However, over time, tensions between the churches spread to the people. With the Crusades, conflicts intensified, reaching their peak in 1204 when Latin forces captured Constantinople. Efforts to reconcile the churches in the following centuries were largely unsuccessful, and this division between the Eastern and Western churches remains unresolved even today.